Okay, go ahead.
Um,
I'm recording. You don't want to read with food in your mouth?
I mean, I will, but it might make somebody mad.
It's okay. Okay. You can go now.
Oh, okay. This is the addendum to, what did we just finish?
Sales.
Sales, yeah. So, okay. So addendum, revised APB valuation advisory number 4. Issue. As part of its ongoing responsibilities, the APB is tasked with identifying where appraisers and appraisal users believe additional guidance is required. One such issue identified by the APB is identifying comparable properties. Comparability analysis is a fundamental study in determining property value. This analysis involves a side-by-side examination of physical and transaction characteristics of the identified comparable properties relative to the subject. The reliability of this valuation technique relies heavily on the proper selection of suitable comparable properties. I'm scrolling. Okay. Still under identifying comparable properties, real property valuation considers 3 approaches to value which are distinctly different given their underlying foundational premises. However, all 3 approaches rely on a comparability analysis in developing credible results under each approach. The sales comparison approach provides an indication of value based on units of comparison derived from sales of similar or comparable properties. The cost approach requires land value comparability analysis, cost comparability analysis, and market extracted depreciation comparability. The income approach requires income lease comparability, expense comparability, income potential comparability, capitalization rate, and minimum acceptable rate of return on investment comparability. All of the above approaches rely on the same fundamental underpinnings of determining comparability. Okay, fine, underpinnings. Under property characteristics. The principle of substitution is the foundation of comparability. It states that a rational buyer will not pay more for an item than the cost of an acceptable substitute. The appraiser must analyze transactions of closed sales, pending sales, and listings of properties and determine which are acceptable substitutes by weighing the elements of comparison. In developing an opinion of value for the subject property, the appraiser attempts to answer the question, what would a buyer of the comparable property have paid for the subject property given the observed sale price or asking price in the case of a listing for the comparable property?
That last paragraph.
The appraiser weighs the relevance of the property characteristics, including but not limited to location, economic, legal, and physical factors, based on the importance assigned by market participants. The most relevant property characteristics are then examined on each available property. By examining and weighing the relevant property characteristics, the appraiser is better prepared to select the most appropriate comparable properties available. Another court has defined a comparable property as one that has similar use, function, and utility, is influenced by the same set of economic trends and physical, governmental, and social factors, and has the potential of a similar highest and best use.
Skip a page.
Under comparable suitability. Sales information. Before a property can be considered a comparable, the appraiser must confirm the type of sale transaction. In other words, did the sale occur under conditions commensurate with the type and definition of value under consideration? In the case of market value, the following factors must be considered. Oh, hang on. Number 1, did the sale convey property rights similar to the property rights being appraised? Were the property rights similarly encumbered or unencumbered at the time of sale? Were both the buyer and seller typically motivated? That's the second question. Number 3, were both parties well informed or advised of and each acting in what they considered their own best interests? Number 4, was the property allowed exposure in the open market for a reasonable length of time? Number 5, was payment made in cash or its equivalent? Number 6, was financing, if any, on terms generally available in the community at the time of sale and typical for the property's type in its locale? Number 7, did the price represent normal consideration for the property sold, unaffected by special financing amounts and or terms, services, fees, costs, and other credits incurred in the transaction? There's a star down there. Do you want me to read that?
72 and 73.
Okay. So magnitude of adjustments. In markets where competing properties are highly similar to the subject property, it is unlikely that large and or numerous adjustments would be required. Scooting on down the next page. According to Fannie Mae, a property is comparable if the market considers it a competitive substitute. Once a property is determined to be comparable by the appraiser, then appropriate analysis and market adjustments are applied. Analysis and adjustments to comparable sales must be based on market data for the particular neighborhood and for competing locations, not on predetermined or assumed dollar amount adjustments. Adjustments must be made without regard for the percentage or amount of the dollar adjustments. The bold is added for Adjustments must be made without regard for the percentage or amount of the dollar adjustments. And then we're going to skip on down a couple of pages. Yeah.
No, you missed some. Okay.
Can we move the mic over so I can lay my recording?
Yeah.
Okay. If the subject property has a significant element of comparison that competing properties lack, or conversely, if the subject property lacks a significant element of comparison that competing properties possess, explanation is necessary. In such situations, generally recognized appraisal methodology would dictate an effort to use comparable properties that are both superior and inferior to the subject for that specific element of comparison. This process is often referred to as bracketing. Comparing properties with superior, similar, and inferior elements of comparison to the subject property may assist in validating the adjustments applied.
Okay.
Okay, skipping down. When a sales comparison approach requires substantial and varied adjustments, the reconciliation should enable the reader to understand why the sales were used. Adequate reconciliation is required and is a required and integral part of any value conclusion. Standards Rule 16A of the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice states, in developing a real property appraisal, an appraiser must reconcile the quality and quantity of data available and analyzed within the approaches used. Highest and best use. A necessary consideration for determining if a property is comparable is whether the highest and best use of the subject property and the competing property is the same. Appraisers have a special responsibility to scrutinize the comparability of all data used in a value assignment. They must fully understand the concept of comparability and should avoid comparing properties with different highest and best uses, limiting their search for comparables or selecting inappropriate factors for comparison. Likewise, the Supreme Court of the United States in Mississippi and Rum River Boom Company versus Patterson, 98 U.S. 403 in 1878, states that the highest and best use of a property should consider a change in current use of a property by reference to the uses for which the property is suitable, having regard to the existing business or wants of the community, or such as may be reasonably expected in the immediate future. These factors can be applied to both the subject property and the selection of comparable properties. Market area and neighborhood characteristics. Location is a primary consideration in the comparable property selection process. Ideally, a comparable property would compete with the subject property in location as well as other characteristics. When considering a comparable property's location, competitiveness to the subject property's local market performance and characteristics are measured alongside the comparable property's local market. Preferably, the comparable property is located in the subject property's market area. While the terms of market area and neighborhood are often used interchangeably, in truth the two terms have distinctly different meanings in both residential and non-residential appraising. Data and analysis related to a neighborhood is broad and general in nature, whereas data and analysis related to a market area is specific and related to a particular property type or category. The confusion between these two concepts arises in practice because the method of delineation for both a market area and a neighborhood follow the same four basic principles. Both can be defined by their physical boundaries, man-made and natural, and their intangible boundaries, social and political. Appraisers make a distinction between the neighborhood in which a property is situated and the market area in which comparable properties will be found are located. Market area is formally defined as the geographic or location delineation of the market for a specific category of real estate. For example, the area in which alternative similar properties effectively compete with the subject property in the minds of probable potential purchasers and users. In contrast, a neighborhood is defined more generally as a group of complementary land uses. In other words, the neighborhood boundaries in which the subject property is located may contain residential properties as well as non-residential properties that serve the residents of the neighborhood, whereas the boundaries of the market area for the subject property is based on the area in which similar properties compete with one another. In some cases, the subject property's neighborhood and market area may have the same boundaries, but in other cases, the market area may contain several neighborhoods or portions of different neighborhoods. The market area is defined by the type of property, the type of transaction, rental or sale, the geographic area in which competition exists, and the homogeneity, I can't hardly say it, the homogeneity of properties within its boundaries.
Skip page 10 altogether, and then read 11 through 14. The full pages.
Okay.
Hold it.
You hold it. So,
okay, yeah. Starting on page 11.
On page 11, is that a continuation of market characteristics that delineate a market area?
Okay.
Possible demographic, socioeconomic, lifestyle, geographic, and economic characteristics to consider in segmenting markets is listed below. Not an exhaustive list and not in any specified order. The type of structures and architectural style, current land use, typical site size, tenure and vacancy rates, income levels, average median incomes, range of incomes. There's no easy way to read that. Geographic characteristics: climate, natural resources, natural recreational opportunities, etc. Population trends and rate of growth. Median prices and price range distribution. Economy, jobs, industries, diversification, growth, tax district, etc. Cultural and entertainment opportunities. Educational resources available, including school districts. Infrastructure. Affordability. Availability of necessary services, hospitals, public transportation, utilities, etc. Exposure to nearby properties, secluded or densely improved. Absorption rates, demand and market times. Condition and quality of residential and or non-residential properties. Sustainability, green features or characteristics. Rental rates. Historical renovations or newly built housing, non-residential properties. Typical building or housing size. Demographic components, family mix, age, purchasing power, etc. The segmenting of a market should take into consideration these similar applicable data categories that are considered most relevant for the property type and use. Demographic, socioeconomic, consumer behavior, economic, and lifestyle data can be retrieved or purchased through several available private and public resources, both locally and nationally. Am I reading the summary?
You read the next 3 pages.
Okay. In summary, the identification of what constitutes a similar or comparable property is critical to the proper application of the 3 approaches to value. The appraiser identifies the comparability of the property by determining whether it is a competitive substitute for the subject property. The quantity and or magnitude of the adjustments do not dictate comparability. The appraiser has to adequately explain and support the rationale for using the comparable properties selected in the appraisal report. Such narrative assists in demonstrating the reliability and credibility of the opinion of value. Where the comparable properties possess significant differences from the subject property, additional comparable properties may be included for additional support of the opinion of value. The appraiser cannot control the quality or suitability of the activity available in the market during the time frame of analysis. Information could be limited in many markets, and many properties do not lend themselves to simplified comparison. In such cases, analysis of older transactions may also be required due to limited current activity in the market. However, such data should be cautiously considered. It is necessary for the appraiser to clearly express these limitations and to reconcile the reliability of the sales where a substantial number of the elements are sufficiently different. If the subject property has a significant element of comparison that competing properties lack, or conversely, if the subject property lacks a significant element of comparison that competing properties possess, explanation is necessary. In such situations, generally recognized appraisal methodology would dictate an effort to use comparable properties that are both superior and inferior to the subject for that specific element of comparison. This process is often referred to as bracketing. Comparing properties with superior, similar, and inferior elements of comparison to the subject property may assist in validating the adjustments applied. A necessary consideration for determining if a property is comparable is whether the highest and best use of the subject property and the competing property is the same. Likewise, an appraiser should consider a change in the current use of a property by reference to the uses for which the property is suitable or such as may be reasonably expected in the immediate future. These factors can be applied to both the subject property and the selection of comparable properties. Location is a primary consideration in the comparable property selection process. Ideally, a comparable property would compete with the subject property in location as well as other characteristics. When considering a comparable property's location, competitiveness to the subject property, the subject property's local market performance and characteristics are measured alongside the comparable property's local market. Preferably, the comparable property is located in the subject property's market area. Glossary of terms and definitions. Bracketing. A process in which an appraiser determines a probable range of values for a property by applying comparative analysis techniques to data such as a group of sales. The array of comparable sales may be divided into three groups: those superior to the subject, those similar to the subject, and those inferior to the subject. The sale price reflected by the sales requiring downward adjustments and those requiring upward adjustment refine the probable range of values for the subject and identify a value range, such as a bracket, in which the final value opinion will fall. Comparable property. Properties that are similar to the property being appraised. Or, a comparable property is a property that has been the subject of a recent transaction and is sufficiently similar that it can be used to measure the value of another property. A comparable property should be the subject of a recent arm's length transaction and ideally should be similar in location, age and design, construction and condition, and size and layout to the subject property, such as what is or has been available in a similar market. In practice, an ideal comparable property hardly ever exists. Instead, a valuer or appraiser extrapolates information on values from similar properties, makes adjustments and allowances, and uses his judgment to apply the resultant figure to the property he is seeking to value. Comparable property, rental. A property that is representative of the rental housing choices of the subject's primary market area and that is similar in construction, size, amenities, location, and or age. Comparable and competitive properties are generally used to derive market rent and to evaluate the subject's position in the market. Competitive property competition. Among competitive properties, the level of productivity and amenities or benefits characteristics of each property considering the advantageous or disadvantageous position of the property relative to the competitors. Competitive property rental. A property that is comparable to the subject and that competes at nearly the same levels and tenant profiles such as age, family, or income. I need to reread that. A competitive property rental is a property that is comparable to the subject and that competes at nearly the same rent levels as tenant profile such as age, family, or income. District, a type of market area characterized by homogeneous land use such as apartment, commercial, industrial, or agricultural. Highest and best use. The reasonably probable and legal use of vacant land or an improved property that is physically possible, appropriately supported, and financially feasible, and that results in the highest value. Market area. The geographic region from which a majority of demand and the majority of competition are drawn. Or the geographic or locational delineation of the market for a specific category of real estate, such as the area in which alternative similar properties effectively compete with the subject property in the minds of probable potential purchasers and users. Neighborhood, a group of complementary land uses, a congruous grouping of inhabitants, buildings, or business properties. Principle of substitution. The principle of substitution states that when several similar or commensurate commodities, goods, or services are available, the one with the lowest price attracts the greatest demand and widest distribution. This principle assumes rational, prudent market behavior with no undue cost due to delay. According to the principle of substitution, a buyer will not pay more for one property than for another that is equally desirable.